At first, it doesn't feel like a turning point. There's no dramatic music, no explosive confrontation, no clear moment where everything suddenly shifts. On the surface, it looks like another calm interaction inside Sister Wives, the kind of scene viewers have watched countless times before. But this time, something is different. And the difference doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly. Through tone. Through timing. Through one very specific choice made by Janelle Brown that seems small at first, but carries more weight the longer you sit with it. Because what she does in this moment isn't loud. It's not emotional in the traditional sense. It's not even confrontational. But it changes everything. The scene begins in a familiar way. The environment feels steady, the energy controlled. Nothing immediately signals that this is going to be anything more than a routine exchange. And that's exactly what makes it so easy to miss what's really happening. Janelle isn't reacting the way she used to. That's the first subtle shift. There's a level of calm in her presence that feels different. Not passive, not distant, but grounded. It's the kind of calm that comes from clarity rather than avoidance. And that clarity shows up not in what she says right away, but in how she chooses to engage. There's a pause before she responds. Not a long one, but long enough to feel intentional. And in that pause, you can almost sense that something has already been decided internally, like she's no longer figuring things out in real time. She already knows where she stands. And that changes the energy of the entire moment. Because when someone enters a conversation without uncertainty, without the need to process out loud, their responses carry a different kind of weight. They feel settled, final, even when they're quiet. There's a point where a response could have followed an old pattern, where things might have become more reactive, more emotionally open, more driven by the moment itself. But that doesn't happen. Instead, Janelle P's things measured. Her tone stays even. Her words are clear, but not expansive. And that restraint is where the shift really begins. Because this isn't about holding back. It's about choosing what matters enough to say, and what doesn't. That distinction is powerful, and it's new. There's also something happening with how she listens. It's not just passive acknowledgement. It's not simply waiting for her turn to speak. There's a presence there, but it's different from before. It's less about absorbing everything and more about evaluating it. You can see it in the timing of her responses, in the way she doesn't immediately feel silence, in the way she allows moments to sit without rushing to resolve them. And that ability, to let things exist without reacting instantly, creates space. Not empty space, but intentional space. A space where control exists. A space where she decides how the moment moves forward. There's a moment where the conversation edges toward something deeper, something that might have once pulled her into a more emotional response. You can feel the possibility. It's there, just beneath the surface. But instead of stepping into it, she holds her position. She doesn't escalate. She doesn't expand. She doesn't avoid it either. She simply doesn't give it more than it deserves. And that is the moment everything changes. Because for the first time, it feels like she is no longer responding to the dynamic. She's defining her place within it. And that shift is quiet, but undeniable. Another detail that stands out is how her responses don't seek validation. There's no sense of needing agreement, no attempt to convince, no emotional reaching. And that absence is just as meaningful as anything she says, because it signals independence, not distance, not disconnection, but a grounded sense of self that doesn't rely on how the other person responds. And that kind of independence transforms interaction. It removes pressure. It removes expectation. It changes the purpose of the conversation entirely. Now it's not about resolving something together. It's about expressing something clearly and allowing it to stand on its own. There's also a shift in pacing that follows her lead. The conversation slows down, but not in a heavy or uncomfortable way, in a controlled way, a deliberate way, where each response feels like it has been considered before being spoken. And that pacing gives everything more weight, because nothing feels rushed, nothing feels reactive, everything feels chosen. There's a moment where silence appears again, but this time it feels different. It doesn't feel like hesitation. It feels like completion, like she has said what she needed to say, and there's no need to add more. And that kind of silence carries confidence, because it shows that she's not trying to fill the space. She's allowing it, letting the moment exist without needing to shape it further. And that's not something we've always seen before. There's also something subtle happening with emotional boundaries. They're present, but they're not defensive. They're not built out of resistance. They're built out of understanding. Understanding of what she's willing to engage with. Understanding of what no longer requires her energy. And that clarity defines every choice she makes in the scene. From what she responds to how she responds, to what she leaves untouched. And that last part, the thing she doesn't engage with, is just as important as everything else. Because sometimes, what you choose not to respond to reveals more than what you do. And in this moment, that choice is clear. She's no longer reacting to everything. She's selecting what matters. And that selectiveness changes the entire dynamic. By the time the scene continues, nothing has exploded. Nothing dramatic has happened. No obvious conflict. No major declaration. But something has shifted in a way that feels permanent. Because what Janelle Brown did in this moment wasn't about creating a reaction. It was about redefining her role. Quietly, calmly, completely. And once that shift happens, everything that follows is going to feel different, even if it doesn't look like it at first. Once that quiet shift settles in, the entire interaction begins to take on a different shape. It's no longer just about what is being said in the moment. It's about the presence that Janelle Brown is bringing into it inside Sister Wives. Because now, instead of reacting to the flow of conversation, she's setting the pace of it. And that difference becomes clearer with every exchange. There's a noticeable change in how she handled space. Earlier, space in a conversation might have felt like something to fill, something that needed to be resolved quickly to keep things moving. But here, space is allowed to exist. A pause happens and she doesn't rush to close it. She lets it sit. And that simple choice changes the tone completely. Because when someone doesn't feel the need to fill silence, it shows a level of comfort, not just with the moment, but with themselves. There's also a shift in how she receives what's being said to her. It's not about absorbing everything or reacting immediately. There's a filter now. You can feel it in the way her responses are slightly delayed. Not because she doesn't have something to say, but because she's deciding what actually deserves a response. And that decision-making process is where her power shows up. There's a moment where a comment could easily pull the conversation in a familiar direction, one that might have led to explanation, justification, or even subtle defensiveness in the past. But this time it doesn't. Instead of engaging with it fully, she acknowledges it just enough to keep the interaction moving, but not enough to give it control. And that balance is precise. It's not dismissive. It's not confrontational. It's controlled. And that control signals something important, that she is no longer participating in the dynamic the same way she used to. Another detail that becomes more obvious is how her tone stays consistent, regardless of what's being said to her. It doesn't rise, it doesn't sharpen, it doesn't shift dramatically. It remains steady. And that steadiness acts like an anchor in the conversation, because when one person maintains that level of consistency, it naturally influences the entire interaction. Everything begins to match that energy. Everything slows down. Everything stabilizes. There's also something happening with how she chooses her words. They're direct, but not expansive. Clear, but not emotionally loaded. It's like she's communicating exactly what needs to be said. Nothing more, nothing less. And that precision removes ambiguity. It removes the need for interpretation. It leaves very little space for misunderstanding. And that clarity changes the dynamic even further. Because now the conversation isn't about trying to figure out what she means. It's about accepting what she's already made clear. There's a moment where the conversation edges towards something that could have invited more emotional depth. Something that might have once led to a longer exchange. More explanation. More back and forth. But again, she doesn't go there. She stays within her boundary. Not by avoiding the moment, but not by expanding it. And that distinction matters. Because it shows that she's not afraid of the depth. She's simply choosing not to enter it. There's also a shift in how emotional responsibility is being handled. Instead of taking on the weight of the entire interaction, she holds only her part of it. She responds. She listens. She engages, but only to the extent that aligns with her own clarity. And that changes everything. Because it removes the imbalance that often exists when one person carries more emotional weight than the other. Now the interaction feels more even, more balanced, more contained. Another subtle but powerful detail is how she doesn't seek to extend the conversation unnecessarily. When a point is made, she lets it stand. She doesn't circle back to it. She doesn't reopen it. She allows it to exist as it is. And that ability to let things remain complete, without needing to add more, creates a sense of finality in each exchange. It gives her weight, because they're not being diluted by repetition or over-explanation. There's also a noticeable absence of emotional urgency. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels like it needs immediate resolution. And that lack of urgency creates calm, but it also signals confidence, because urgency often comes from uncertainty, from the need to fix something quickly, or to gain clarity in the moment. But here, there's no rush, because clarity already exists, internally. And that internal clarity is what's guiding everything. There's a moment where silence appears again, but this time it feels even more defined. It's not just a pause, it's a boundary, a clear indication that she has said what she needed to say, and there's no more to add. And instead of filling that silence, she allows it to stand. And that choice reinforces everything. It reinforces her control, her clarity, her independence within the interaction. There's also a shift in how the other side of the conversation responds. Whether it's subtle or not, the energy adjusts. Because when one person changes how they show up, the dynamic naturally shifts around them.
The usual patterns don't quite fit anymore. The usual responses don't land the same way. And that creates a new kind of interaction. One that's still calm, still measured, but noticeably different. By the time this part of the scene continues, the change is no longer just subtle. It's consistent. It's visible in every pause, every response, every choice to engage or not engage. And it all points back to the same realization. Janelle Brown isn't just participating in this moment. She's redefining it. Quietly, steadily, and in a way that doesn't need to be announced to be understood.
As that shift continues to settle, the moment begins to feel less like a conversation and more like a demonstration of control, quiet, steady, and completely intentional inside Sister Wives. Because at this point, what Janelle Brown is doing isn't just different, it's consistent. And consistency is what turns a single choice into a pattern. There's a moment where the conversation could easily return to an older rhythm, one where things become slightly more reactive, slightly more open, slightly more influenced by what's being said in real time. But it doesn't. Instead, she holds the same pace, the same tone, the same level of engagement. And that steadiness makes it clear that this isn't situational, it's intentional. There's also something important happening with how she responds to pressure, even when that pressure is subtle. It's not direct, it's not confrontational, but it exists in the form of expectation, the expectation to respond a certain way, to explain more, to engage deeper. And that expectation is quietly declined. Not rejected, not challenged, just not fulfilled. And that's what makes it powerful. Because instead of pushing back against the dynamic, she simply steps outside of it. There's a point where a question or statement could naturally invite expansion, more detail, more explanation, more emotional context. But her response stays contained, clear, complete. And then it stops. No extra justification, no effort to elaborate beyond what's necessary. And that restraint creates a boundary that doesn't need to be explained. It's understood through action. Another detail that becomes more noticeable is how she doesn't mirror the energy being presented to her. In many conversations, especially emotional ones, there's a natural tendency to match tone, to align with the other person's level of intensity or openness. But here, she stays consistent with her own. No matter what comes toward her, her tone remains steady. Her pacing remains controlled. Her engagement remains measured. And that lack of mirroring shifts the balance. Because now, the interaction isn't being shaped equally from both sides. It's being anchored by her. There's also a subtle shift in how authority shows up. Not authority in a dominant sense, but in a grounded sense. The kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and not needing to adjust based on external input. And that kind of authority is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't try to control the other person. It simply defines itself and lets everything else respond to it. There's a moment where the conversation edges towards something that feels familiar, something that might have previously led to a longer exchange, a deeper dive, or even a slight emotional shift. But once again, it doesn't go there. She acknowledges it. She responds just enough. And then she allows it to pass. And that repeated choice reinforces the same message. She is no longer engaging in the same way. There's also something happening with how she handles emotional cues. Instead of reacting to them, she observes them. There's a difference. Reaction is immediate, often automatic. Observation creates space. And in that space, she decides what to do next. And that decision-making process is what keeps everything aligned with her internal clarity. Another layer that becomes clear is how she doesn't seek to change the outcome of the conversation. She's not trying to steer it toward evolution. She's not trying to create agreement. She's not even trying to fully explore every point that comes up. She's simply expressing her position and allowing it to stand. And that changes the purpose of the interaction completely, because now it's not about reaching a shared conclusion.
It's about maintaining individual clarity within a shared space. There's also a noticeable absence of emotional escalation, even when there are moments that could naturally build, moments that carry a little more weight, a little more potential. Everything stays level. And that level tone becomes a constant, a baseline that doesn't shift. And when that baseline holds, it prevents the conversation from moving into deeper or more intense territory. There's a moment where silence appears again, and by now it feels almost like part of her language. Not something to avoid, not something to fill, but something to use. A way of reinforcing boundaries. A way of allowing her words to settle without adding more. And that use of silence carries confidence, because it shows that she doesn't need to keep speaking to maintain presence. Her presence is already established. Another important detail is how she doesn't revisit what's already been said. There's no circling back, no repetition, no attempt to reinforce her point through additional explanation. Once she says something, she lets it remain. And that finality gives her words weight, because they're not being adjusted or expanded after the fact. They're complete as they are. There's also a shift in how emotional energy is distributed. Instead of flowing outward into the conversation, it feels more contained, focused, directed only where necessary. And that containment creates a sense of calm, but also a sense of limitation, because energy that isn't expressed doesn't disappear. It stays internal. And that internalization becomes part of the dynamic. As the scene continues, all of these elements begin to work together. The steady tone, the measured responses, the controlled pacing, the intentional use of silence. And together, they form something more than just a calm interaction. They form a new structure. A new way of engaging that is defined by clarity, by boundaries, and by choice. By the end of this part, it's no longer just about what she did in a single moment, it's about how she's now showing up entirely. Because Janelle Brown isn't just responding differently, she's operating from a different place. One that is steady, self-defined, and no longer shaped by the same expectations that once influenced everything. And that shift is what changes everything, even if it never needs to be said out loud. As this new pattern continues to hold, the moment begins to feel less like a conversation shaped by two people and more like one being quietly structured by a single, steady presence inside Sister Wives. And that presence is coming from Janelle Brown. Not in an overpowering way, not in a controlling way, but in a grounded, unwavering way that doesn't bend or shift depending on what comes toward her. Because at this stage, it's no longer just about how she responds, it's about what she refuses to participate in. There's a moment where the conversation naturally leans towards something that feels familiar, something that might have once pulled her into a longer explanation, a deeper emotional exchange, or even a slight attempt to clarify or defend her position. But this time, she doesn't follow it. She lets it exist, and then she lets it pass. And that decision is quiet, but defining. Because choosing not to engage with something that once required energy is a clear sign that priorities have changed. There's also something happening with how she handles repetition. In many interactions, especially ones with history, there's a tendency to revisit the same points, to re-explain, to circle back in hopes of being better understood. But here, that cycle is absent. She doesn't repeat herself. She doesn't reinforce her statements. She says what needs to be said, and then she moves on. And that creates a sense of closure within each moment, because nothing is being reopened, nothing is being reworked. Everything is allowed to stand as it is. There's a moment where the other side of the conversation introduces something that could have easily shifted the tone, something that might have once triggered a stronger reaction or invited a deeper emotional response. But again, she remains steady. Her tone doesn't change. Her posture doesn't shift. Her response stays aligned with the same controlled clarity she's maintained from the beginning. And that consistency begins to reshape the entire interaction, because when one person no longer reacts in expected ways, the usual patterns don't hold. The dynamic has to adjust, even if it's subtle, even if it's not immediately obvious. Another detail that becomes more noticeable is how she doesn't seek to fill emotional gaps. When something isn't fully explored, she doesn't step in to complete it. When a moment could be expanded, she doesn't push it further. She allows things to remain where they are. And that restraint creates space, but it's a different kind of space. not one that invites more, one that signals enough. Enough has been said, enough has been shared. There's no need to extend beyond that. There's also a shift in how emotional cues are received. Instead of reacting to them directly, she acknowledges them in a way that doesn't amplify them. She doesn't ignore them, but she doesn't give them more weight than necessary either. And that balance is precise. It keeps the interaction grounded. It prevents escalation. And it reinforces the same controlled tone that has defined the entire moment. There's a point where silence enters again, and by now it feels almost intentional in its placement. Not accidental, not uncertain, but chosen. A pause that exists not because there's nothing to say, but because nothing more needs to be said. And that kind of silence carries authority, because it shows that she is comfortable letting the moment settle without needing to shape it further. Another subtle but powerful shift is how she doesn't respond to every layer of what's being presented. She listens, but selectively. She engages, but precisely. Only the parts that align with what matters to her receive attention. Everything else is allowed to pass without reaction. And that selectiveness changes the entire dynamic, because it removes unnecessary energy from the interaction. It keeps everything focused, clear, contained. There's also a noticeable absence of emotional negotiation. She's not trying to meet in the middle. She's not adjusting her position to create agreement. She's not reshaping her words to be more acceptable. She's simply stating where she stands and allowing.
As this pattern continues, what becomes even more clear is that the shift isn't just visible in what Janelle Brown is doing. It's visible in what the entire moment is no longer able to pull from her inside Sister Wives. Because there used to be a kind of emotional accessibility in these interactions, a sense that if something was brought into the conversation, it would be engaged with, explored, maybe even expanded into something deeper. Now that access feels different, more limited, more intentional. And that limitation is where the real change lives. There's a moment where something is said that carries a bit more weight than the rest. Not dramatically, not in a way that demands a reaction, but enough that, in the past, it might have opened the door to a longer exchange. But this time, it doesn't. She acknowledges it, she responds just enough, and then she lets it end. And that ending feels complete. Not avoided, not unfinished, just closed. And that ability to close a moment without needing to reopen it is something new. Because it shows that she's no longer looking for resolution through repetition. She's not trying to work through the same layers again. She's recognizing when something has already been understood and choosing not to revisit it. There's also something happening with how emotional invitations are being handled. Certain statements, certain tones, certain pauses, they all carry the potential to invite more, to invite explanation, vulnerability, or even subtle emotional negotiation. But those invitations aren't being accepted, not rejected either, just not taken. And that distinction matters. Because she's not pushing against the interaction, she's simply not stepping further into it than she needs to. There's a quiet sense of completion in how she communicates. Each response feels like a full thought, not something that needs to be continued or expanded later. And that completion changes the rhythm of everything, because there's no lingering thread, no unfinished idea waiting to be picked up again. Everything exists in its own contained space. There's also a noticeable difference in how she handles emotional weight. When something carries more meaning, she doesn't amplify it. She doesn't match it with a heavier response. She meets it with the same steady tone she's maintained throughout. And that steadiness absorbs intensity rather than reflecting it. It keeps everything level. It prevents the moment from rising into something more charged. And that ability to absorb rather than react is a form of control that feels effortless, but is actually very deliberate. Another subtle detail is how she doesn't seek alignment. There's no effort to bring both sides to the same understanding, no attempt to make sure everything is fully agreed upon. She expresses her position and then allows the other side to exist separately. And that separation creates clarity, because now there's no blending of perspectives, no softening to create unity, just two distinct positions coexisting within the same space. There's also a shift in how energy flows through the conversation. It's not moving outward in waves of reaction and response. It's contained, focused, directed only where necessary. And that containment gives the moment a kind of stillness, not silence, but stability, a sense that nothing is going to move beyond what has already been said. There's a moment where silence appears again, and by now it feels like part of her language, a way of communicating without adding words, a way of reinforcing that nothing more needs to be said. And that silence doesn't feel uncertain. It feels deliberate, like a choice rather than a gap.
Another important layer is how she doesn't adjust based on feedback. If something is met with a certain tone, a certain reaction, she doesn't shift to match it. She stays consistent. And that consistency removes the push-pull dynamic that often shapes conversations like this. Because when one person stops adjusting, the interaction loses its usual back-and-forth rhythm. It becomes more defined, more stable, more contained. There's also something happening with emotional independence that becomes more pronounced here. She's fully present, fully engaged, but not dependent on the interaction to shape how she feels or responds. And that independence creates space that isn't filled with tension or expectation, just space that exists because nothing more is needed. As the scene continues, these patterns don't change. They hold, steady, consistent, uninterrupted. And that consistency reinforces everything, because it shows that this isn't a temporary shift. It's not something that applies only to this moment. It's a new way of engaging, a new baseline, a new structure that defines how interaction works now. By the time this part settles, the realization becomes even clearer. What Janelle Brown has done isn't about reacting differently. It's about no longer being influenced in the same way, no longer being pulled into patterns that once defined these moments, no longer giving energy to things that don't align with where she stands now. And that kind of shift doesn't need to be explained. It shows itself in what no longer happens, in what no longer expands, in what no longer has access to them in the same way. And that's what makes it so powerful, because sometimes the biggest change isn't what someone starts doing, it's what they stop allowing. As this steadiness continues without interruption, the moment starts to reveal something even deeper, not just a shift in behavior, but a shift in identity within the interaction itself inside Sister Wives. Because what Janelle Brown is showing now isn't just control, it's definition, a clear, grounded sense of who she is in this space, and who she is no longer willing to be. And that difference becomes more visible with every exchange that follows. There's a moment where the conversation subtly leans towards something that once might have required explanation, not because she needed to explain herself, but because the dynamic itself used to expect it. That expectation is still there, quietly present, but she doesn't meet it. She lets it pass, and in doing so, she removes its influence completely. There's no resistance, no visible pushback, just a quiet absence of participation in something that once shaped the interaction. And that absence is powerful, because it changes the rules without needing to announce them. Another detail that becomes more noticeable is how she no longer seems to carry the responsibility of maintaining the emotional flow of the conversation. In earlier dynamics, there might have been moments where she helped guide the interaction forward, filling gaps, smoothing over pauses, ensuring that things continued moving. But here, that responsibility is gone. She doesn't rush to keep things going. She doesn't step in to stabilize the moment. She allows the conversation to exist on its own. And that changes everything. Because now the flow isn't being maintained by effort, it's being defined by structure. And that structure is hers. There's also something happening with how she responds to unfinished moments. When something is left open, she doesn't feel the need to close it. When a thought isn't fully developed, she doesn't complete it. She lets it remain as it is. And that willingness to leave things incomplete is a sign of confidence, because it shows she's not seeking resolution in every moment. She's comfortable with what has already been established. There's a point where the conversation could easily shift into a space that invites more emotional depth, more context, more reflection, more shared understanding. But again, she doesn't step into it. She acknowledges the moment, she responds within her boundary, and then she lets it settle. And that settling is consistent. It happens again and again, not as avoidance, but as choice, a deliberate decision to not go beyond a certain point. There's also a shift in how emotional cues are interpreted. Instead of reacting to them directly, she processes them internally, and then decides what, if anything, needs to be expressed. And that internal processing creates a gap between stimulus and response, a gap that gives her control, because in that space, she is no longer reacting automatically, she is choosing. There's a moment where silence appears again, and now it feels almost like a signature, a defining part of how she communicates, not something that interrupts the flow, but something that shapes it, a pause that signals completion, a pause that reinforces boundaries, a pause that says more by saying nothing at all. And that kind of silence carries clarity, because it removes any ambiguity about whether more is coming. It shows that what has been said is enough. Another subtle but important detail is how she doesn't revisit emotional ground that has already been covered. Even when there's an opportunity to circle back, to clarify, to expand, to reinforce, she doesn't take it. She lets the past stay where it is. And that forward movement, even within a controlled structure, creates a sense of progress. Not emotional expansion, but directional clarity. There's also a noticeable absence of emotional negotiation. She's not adjusting her tone to meet the other person halfway. She's not reshaping her words to create a smoother interaction. She's simply maintaining her position and allowing everything else to respond to it. And that creates a new kind of balance, one that isn't based on compromise, but on definition. There's a moment where the energy of the conversation could shift, where something might have once disrupted the calm, introduced tension, or created a need for adjustment. But it doesn't, because her consistency absorbs it, her steadiness holds it, and nothing breaks the pattern. There's also something happening with how presence is expressed. She is fully present, fully engaged, but not overextended, not giving more than necessary, not stepping beyond her boundary. And that measured presence creates a sense of control that feels complete. As the scene continues, all of these elements begin to feel less like choices and more like a new baseline, a way of being that doesn't fluctuate, that doesn't adjust based on external input, that remains steady regardless of what happens within the interaction. And that baseline defines everything. By the time this part settles, it becomes clear that what Janelle Brown has done goes beyond a single moment or a single decision. She has shifted how she exists within the dynamic entirely, what she responds to, what she engages with, what she allows to influence her, and what she leaves untouched. And that shift doesn't need to be explained. It shows itself in the consistency, in the control, in the quiet refusal to participate in anything that no longer aligns with where she stands now. Because sometimes the biggest change isn't what someone starts doing, it's what they stop allowing.
As this new way of engaging continues without interruption, something deeper begins to settle into place, something that goes beyond behavior and into meaning itself inside Sister Wives. Because at this point, it's no longer just about what Janelle Brown is doing differently. It's about what her choices are quietly communicating. And what they're communicating is unmistakable. She's no longer negotiating her place in the dynamic. She already knows it. There's a moment where the conversation brushes up against something that feels like it could have required reassurance in the past, something that might have once created a need to clarify feelings, to soften a statement, or to make sure everything remained emotionally balanced. But that need isn't there anymore. She doesn't move to reassure. She doesn't move to adjust. She simply stays where she is. And that stillness sends a message that words don't need to. Because reassurance is often given when there's uncertainty, when something feels unstable, when there's a need to maintain connection through adjustment. But here, none of that is present. The connection isn't being managed, it's being allowed. And that difference is everything. There's also something happening with how expectations are being handled. Even if they're unspoken, they exist. Expectations about how a moment should unfold, how a response should sound, how deeply something should be explored. But one by one, those expectations are quietly unmet, not challenged, not rejected, just not followed. And over time, that changes the structure of the interaction completely. Because when expectations stop being fulfilled, the dynamic has to shift. It has to adapt to a new reality, one where things no longer move in the same predictable ways. There's a point where a statement is made that feels like it could carry more weight if it were expanded, if it were met with a deeper response. But instead, it's met with the same level tone, the same controlled clarity, and then it's allowed to settle. And that settling feels final, not incomplete, not unresolved, just finished. And that sense of completion without expansion becomes one of the defining features of the moment. There's also a noticeable shift in how emotional energy is received. Instead of absorbing everything and responding in kind, she filters it. She decides what matters, what doesn't, what deserves attention, and what can simply pass through without engagement. And that selectiveness creates a new kind of boundary, one that isn't reactive, but proactive, a boundary that exists before the moment even unfolds. There's a moment where silence appears again, and by now it feels almost like a signature move, a pause that carries intention, a pause that replaces what might have once been a longer explanation. And that silence communicates something very clear. There is nothing more to add. There is nothing more required. Everything that needed to be said has already been said. And that clarity removes any ambiguity from the interaction. Another important detail is how she doesn't revisit emotional threads once they've been closed. Even when there's space to reopen them, to add more, to explore further, she doesn't. She lets them remain in the past. And that forward movement reinforces the idea that she's no longer operating within the same emotional cycles. She's not looping back, she's moving through. There's also a shift in how influence works within the moment. External input, tone, wording, subtle emotional cues, doesn't seem to alter her position. It doesn't pull her into a different response. It doesn't change her pacing. And that lack of influence creates stability. Because now, the interaction isn't shaped by shifting emotional currents. It's anchored, grounded in something consistent. There's a moment where the conversation could have introduced tension, even in a subtle way, something that might have once required adjustment, explanation, or even emotional management. But it doesn't land the same way now, because her consistency absorbs it before it can grow. And that ability to absorb without reacting is what keeps everything level. There's also something happening with emotional independence that becomes even more defined here. She's not seeking validation. She's not seeking agreement. She's not even seeking to be fully understood in the moment. She's simply expressing her position and allowing it to exist as it is. And that independence changes the purpose of communication entirely. It's no longer about reaching a shared emotional outcome.
It's about maintaining individual clarity within a shared space. As the scene continues, these patterns don't shift. They don't weaken. They don't break. They hold, consistently. And that consistency reinforces the message behind everything she's doing. This isn't temporary. This isn't situational. This is a new way of existing within the dynamic, a new baseline that defines how she engages, how she responds, how she participates. By the time this part settles, the realization becomes even more grounded. What Janelle Brown has done isn't just about changing her responses. It's about removing herself from patterns that once defined the interaction. It's about no longer meeting expectations that no longer serve her. It's about standing in a position that doesn't need to shift to maintain balance. And that kind of change doesn't need to be explained out loud. It shows itself in the consistency, in the calm, in the quiet refusal to engage beyond what truly matters. Because when someone stops participating in the same way, the entire dynamic has no choice but to change around them. As this steady pattern continues without breaking, something even more subtle begins to take shape. Something that isn't just about control or boundaries anymore, but about how the entire interaction now responds to Janelle Brown inside Sister Wives. Because at this point, she's not just maintaining her position, she's influencing the space itself. And that influence is quiet, but unmistakable. There's a moment where the conversation seems like it might try to shift its direction, almost as if testing whether the old patterns are still available. A tone changes slightly. A phrase carries a hint of something deeper, something that might once have opened the door to a longer exchange. But nothing changes on her end. She remains steady. And because of that, the moment adjusts around her instead. It settles. It softens. It returns to the same controlled level she's been holding. And that's when it becomes clear. She's no longer adapting to the dynamic. The dynamic is adapting to her. There's also something happening with how emotional cues lose their ability to expand the moment. In the past, even subtle cues could grow into something larger, something that would shift the tone or deepen the exchange. But now, those cues don't carry the same impact. They appear, they're acknowledged, and then they fade, because they're not being given the energy required to grow. And that lack of expansion creates a new kind of stillness, not emptiness, but containment. Everything exists, but nothing extends beyond its initial form. Another detail that becomes more noticeable is how she no longer seems to anticipate reactions. There's no sense of adjusting her words to manage how they'll be received. No softening. No preparation for possible outcomes. She speaks with clarity, and then lets the response be whatever it is. And that release of control over outcomes is powerful, because it shows that her focus is no longer on managing the interaction. It's on maintaining her own position within it. There's a moment where silence enters again, and now it feels like something more than just a pause. It feels like a boundary being reinforced, a clear signal that the moment has reached its natural limit, that nothing further is required. And that silence doesn't invite continuation. It defines completion. There's also a shift in how time feels within the conversation. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels stretched. Everything unfolds at a pace that feels intentional. And that pacing creates a sense of stability that wasn't always this present before. Because when pacing is controlled, so is the experience. Nothing gets ahead of itself. Nothing spirals. Everything stays within a defined rhythm. Another subtle but important change is how emotional ownership is now clearly divided. She holds her position, she expresses it, and then she lets it stand. She doesn't carry the responsibility of how it's received. She doesn't take on the weight of the entire interaction. And that separation creates balance, because now each side exists independently within the same space. There's also a noticeable absence of emotional escalation, even in moments where it might naturally occur. A phrase lands with a bit more weight. A pause lingers a little longer. A tone shifts just slightly. But none of it builds. None of it expands. Everything returns to that same steady baseline. And that return is what defines the structure. Because it shows that no matter what enters the interaction, it will be met with the same level of control. There's a moment where the conversation feels like it might reach a turning point. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift that could change the direction of what follows. But instead of turning, it settles. Once again. And that repeated settling reinforces the same realization. This isn't about where the conversation could go. It's about where it's allowed to go. And that limit is consistent, clear, unchanging. There's also something happening with how presence is experienced. She is fully there, fully engaged, but not overextended, not giving more than necessary, not stepping beyond her boundary. And that measured presence creates a sense of completeness, because nothing feels missing. Nothing feels withheld in a negative way. It simply feels defined. As the scene continues, all of these elements begin to feel less like choices and more like a state of being, a natural way of interacting that doesn't require effort or adjustment. It just exists, steady, consistent, unmoved by what surrounds it. By the time this part settles, it becomes undeniable. What Janelle Brown has done has shifted the balance of the entire interaction. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by consistency, by clarity, by quietly holding a position that doesn't change. And when one person holds that kind of position long enough, everything around them begins to change in response.
As the pattern continues without breaking, something even more subtle becomes impossible to ignore. The sense that the entire interaction is now being structured around the presence of Janelle Brown inside Sister Wives. Because at this stage, it's no longer just about how she responds. It's about how everything else adjusts after she responds. There's a moment where a familiar emotional pathway almost appears again, something that in earlier dynamics would have led to deeper conversation, more explanation, more emotional layering. But this time, it doesn't unfold. It approaches, and then it stops. Not because it's blocked, not because it's resisted, but because there's nothing there to pull it forward anymore. And that absence changes everything. There's also a growing sense that unpredictability has been removed from the interaction, not in a negative way, but in a structural one. You no longer feel unsure about how she will respond. You begin to recognize the pattern: steady tone, measured response, no escalation, no overextension, no unnecessary expansion. And once that pattern becomes familiar, it starts shaping your expectations in real time. Because now, even before she responds, you already know the range she will respond within, and that predictability becomes its own kind of message. There's a moment where something is said that carries emotional weight, enough that it might have once shifted the tone of the entire exchange, but instead of amplifying it, she keeps it contained. She acknowledges it, she processes it, and then she lets it remain exactly where it is, not expanded, not minimized, just placed. And that placement feels final. There's also something happening with how emotional momentum is handled. In many interactions, momentum builds naturally, one idea leading into another, one emotional beat reinforcing the next, gradually increasing intensity or depth. But here, momentum never accumulates. It resets before it can grow. A moment begins to build, and then it settles. Again and again. And that repeated reset creates a very specific atmosphere, one that feels stable but intentionally contained. There's also a shift in how silence functions within the interaction. It's no longer a gap that needs to be filled. It's no longer uncertainty. It's structure, a defined part of the communication pattern that signals completion, clarity, or boundary. When silence appears now, it doesn't ask for continuation. It confirms limitation, and that confirmation becomes part of the language of the scene. Another important detail is how emotional effort is no longer distributed evenly. Previously, there may have been moments where emotional energy was matched, mirrored, or adjusted to maintain connection. But now, that adjustment isn't happening in the same way. She maintains her level, and everything else aligns around it. Not because it is forced, but because it is consistent. There's also something happening with how responses feel increasingly self-contained. Each statement stands on its own. It doesn't depend on what came before it. It doesn't require what comes after it. It exists fully in the moment it is spoken. And that self-containment removes dependency from the interaction. No emotional loops, no unresolved threads pulling the conversation forward, just clear, finished statements. There's a moment where the conversation could have easily drifted into something more emotionally charged, something that might have once required clarification, reassurance, or deeper engagement. But again, it doesn't move there. It stays within its limit, and that limit feels intentional now, not imposed, not enforced, but naturally maintained through consistency. There's also a growing awareness that nothing is being corrected anymore. If something is misunderstood, it isn't reshaped. If something is left open, it isn't completed. If something is emotionally loaded, it isn't expanded. It simply exists as it is, and that acceptance of incompleteness becomes part of the structure, because not everything needs to be resolved for the interaction to continue, and she seems fully aware of that now. As the scene continues, the repetition of these patterns reinforces the same underlying reality. She is no longer participating in the same emotional cycle as before. She is operating within a different framework, one defined by clarity, by boundaries, by control over engagement rather than reaction to it. And by the time this part settles, the realization is unavoidable. What has changed isn't the conversation itself, it's the way she allows herself to exist within it, and that shift quietly changes everything that surrounds her. By the time everything reaches its final stretch,
There's no single moment that can be pointed to as the turning point anymore, because the turning point wasn't one action. It was the accumulation of many small, controlled decisions made by Janelle Brown inside Sister Wives. And that's what makes the change feel so complete now. It didn't arrive loudly. It didn't need confrontation. It simply settled into place through consistency. There's a final sense in the interaction that nothing is trying to be proven anymore. No position is being defended. No emotional ground is being fought for. Instead, what remains is clarity, quiet, steady, and fully formed. And that clarity changes how everything is perceived. Because earlier in the dynamic, meaning often came from reaction, from how quickly something was answered, how emotionally it was handled, how deeply it was engaged with. But now meaning comes from restraint, from what is not expanded, from what is not revisited, from what is allowed to stand on its own without further shaping. There's a moment where something almost invites continuation, almost pulls toward a familiar pattern of explanation or emotional exchange, but it doesn't happen. And the absence of that continuation feels more important than the moment itself, because it confirms the shift is not temporary, it is stable. There's also a final layer of awareness that becomes unavoidable at this stage. The interaction is no longer balanced by emotional back and forth. It is defined by presence and boundaries rather than reaction and response. And within that structure, Janelle Brown remains steady, not overreaching, not retreating, just consistently positioned within her own clarity. And that consistency is what gives the entire moment its meaning. There's a kind of quiet finality in how everything settles, not because anything is resolved in a traditional sense, but because nothing is left unstable. No emotional loose ends are being pulled, no unfinished reactions are demanding closure. Everything exists exactly where it has been placed, and is allowed to remain there. And that is what defines the end of this shift. Not resolution, not conflict, not transformation announced through action, but transformation revealed through behavior that no longer changes based on expectation. And as the moment closes, what stays with you isn't what was said. It's what was consistently withheld from escalation, what was calmly contained, what was clearly defined without needing repetition. Because the most important change here isn't visible in a single exchange. It's visible in the pattern that no longer breaks. And once that pattern is established, it doesn't need to be emphasized again. It simply becomes the new normal. And that is what makes this moment feel so different from everything that came before it. Not because something dramatic happened, but because something quietly stopped needing to happen at all.